No other speakers? I call the clerk.
Government business, order of the day number 1, Social Services Legislation Amendment, Cashless Debit Card Trial Expansion Bill 2018, resumption of debate on the second reading.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Barton.
Thank you, Madam Assistant Speaker. I rise to speak on the Social Services Legislation Amendment, Cashless Debit Card Trial Expansion. This bill proposes to extend the cashless debit card trial to Bundaberg and Hervey Bay. If this bill is successful, all recipients of New Start, Youth Allowance and and parenting payments in the electorate of Hinkler who are under 36 will be forced to become trial participants. They will be forced, Madam Assistant Speaker. The cashless debit card quarantines 80% of an income support payment onto a special debit card which cannot be used to purchase alcohol, gamble or buy gift cards, which could in turn be used to purchase alcohol or gamble. It is expected that around 6,700 people in Bundaberg, Hervey Bay would become trial participants. Labor does not support this bill. As we've said many times now, Labor supports genuinely community-driven initiatives to tackle drug and alcohol abuse. We believe they must be genuinely community-driven, not top-down. Labor does not believe in a blanket approach to income management. We do not support a national rollout of the cashless debit card. Let me repeat that because I know there is a lot of misinformation on social media about this issue. Let me be very, very clear. Labor does not support any nationwide rollout of the cashless debit card. Labor understands that the vast majority of income support recipients are more than capable of managing their own finances. We understand that for many people income management simply isn't necessary. Labor has said all along that we will talk to individual communities and make decisions on a location-by-location basis. After hearing the evidence presented to the Senate inquiry and speaking with people in Bundaberg, it is absolutely clear that the community in Bundaberg do not want to be part of this trial of the cashless debit card. They do not want it in their town. The mayors of both local government areas in the trial region, Bundaberg and the Fraser Coast Shire, opposed the introduction of the cashless debit card in Bundaberg and Hervey Bay, and that has been a very important point that Labor has considered in our decision. The Mayor of Bundaberg, former LNP stalwart and Queensland State Minister Jack Dempsey, says his community has turned against the cashless debit trial after learning the cost. Key groups from Bundaberg region felt ignored by the government's consultation process on this issue, and this, Madam Assistant Speaker, is another really important point that we have considered. Representatives from the Gadrigil Development Corporation explained that Gadrigil is probably considered to be the largest Indigenous organisation in Bundaberg, and there hasn't been any approach on any matter, including the rollout of this trial from the federal minister, and that is a very telling fact, top down. Representatives from a community advocacy group in Bundaberg explained to the Senate inquiry that there has been little to no public consultation, and what has taken place has been done behind closed doors. Labor will only consider the introduction of a new trial site if the Liberals can show that they have agreed formal consultation processes with the community, as well as agreed definition of consent. The flawed evaluation is another important point to consider. On top of that, the ARIMA evaluation into the effectiveness of the existing trials in Ceduna and East Kimberley is inconclusive at best. The evaluation has been criticised by leading academics, and there is insufficient credible evidence at this point to support the establishment of further trials. Janet Hunt, the Deputy Director of the Centre for Aboriginal Economic Policy Research at the Australian National University, said the evaluation showed the cashless debit card had not actually improved safety and violence, despite that being one of the trial objectives. Hunt is critical of the methodology used in the ARIMA evaluation. She argues that people interviewed for the evaluation may have told interviewers that they drank less than before the trial began, but that such recall over a year is not likely to be very reliable. Furthermore, people had to give their identification to the interviewer. They may have said exactly what they thought the interviewer wanted to hear, and certainly would not have incriminated themselves. This is particularly true for the Aboriginal population, who, because of historical reasons, are likely to view authority figures with deep suspicion. Yet last year, the former Minister for Human Services described the cashless debit card trials as a huge success, and the Prime Minister himself has said that the card has seen a massive reduction in alcohol abuse, in drug abuse, in domestic violence and in violence generally. But Janet Hunt made it clear that this was not the case, stating clearly, "Someone needs to tell them that the report does not say these things at all." And this is important because the government's argument for expanding the rollout of this card rests very heavily on this evaluation. When participants were asked about the impact of the trial on their children's lives, only 17% reported feeling their lives were better as a result. To be very frank, Madam Assistant Speaker, I thought the ARIMA evaluation was substandard, and I don't believe that any government should be making significant policy decisions off the back of such poor quality evaluation. Labor will only consider the further expansion of the cashless debit card trial sites when there is much greater evidence and credible evidence of its effectiveness. The cost of the rollout of the cashless debit card is a very important consideration in this debate. We know that the government has already paid $7.9 million of that to the debit card provider Indue, and almost $1.6 million to ARIMA Research to provide a poor quality evaluation. So that in total, of course, is well over $8 million. Labor understands that the current accrued cost of the cashless debit card trial is around $24 million for the two sites to the 15th of March 2018. This means that per head cost of the two trial sites is well over $10,000 per head. There is a better way to achieve the objectives. And it is quite extraordinary that we are debating this bill today without any indication from the Minister about how much it will cost taxpayers to roll out the card at Bundaberg and Hervey Bay. In fact, they still haven't said how much the trial of the goldfields is costing, despite the fact that the trial has been operating there since early May. Perhaps it has something to do with the fact that a local council in Bundaberg did a survey that showed when locals were told how much the trial program would cost to administer, support for the trial in the community dropped to just 26%. So the government are deliberately avoiding telling us the cost per head for political reasons. This is simply unacceptable. The government must say how much the trial at Bundaberg Hervey Bay will cost, as well as the costs for the trials in the goldfields in Western Australia. It is important to note that Labor supported the initiation of trials in Ceduna and East Kimberley, and that supports them continuing until mid-2019 to allow more time for a reliable evaluation to determine whether they have been successful. In April last year, the Shadow Minister for Human Services, Jenny Macklin, and I went to the East Kimberley to meet with community leaders in Kununurra and Wyndham. We met with Wurundjeri, Binari Binja, Yaru, Gawalung, Gordang and Noongar Aria Aboriginal corporations, along with the Wannan Foundation, Kununurra Hospital, St John's Ambulance Services, Kununurra Police, Moogong Sobering Up Shelter, East Kimberley Job Pathways and Department for Child Protection and Family Support, a fairly significant consultation in anyone's estimation. The feedback we received on the cashless card in the East Kimberley was mixed. Some people were in favour of the card and others were strongly opposed, and many people thought the card was just worth trialling. Ian Trust, head of the Woonun Foundation, described the card as a potential circuit breaker for his people. St John's Ambulance in Kununurra said the call-outs for alcohol-related violence had gone down. At a Senate inquiry in Western Australian Police released data on domestic assaults. The 12 months to 30 June 2017 saw 508 domestic assaults in Kununurra. For the 12 months previous to that, July 1, 2015 to 30 June 2016, there were 319. Now that is an increase. I also had the opportunity to visit the Women's Refuge in Kununurra and talk to some of the women staying there. They did not have a positive view of the cashless card. They told us that life had gotten harder with the card, that there was more violence and more crime as cash had become scarce. Others said that the sly grog trade meant that there were ways that people could easily get around the card if they wanted to buy grog. A common sentiment that I heard across the week was that things are so bad in the local community that they were willing to give anything a go. Essentially, they supported the cashless card not out of hope, but out of despair. We've continued talking with people in the local community in the period since our formal consultation. So Labor takes a very clear-eyed view of this issue. We are not being ideological in our approach to this issue. We have a set of guiding principles, and that determines our positions on this debate. Our position on this debate. In summary, Madam Assistant Speaker, Labor does not support this bill. We don't support the expansion of the card to Bundaberg and the Hervey Bay area. The evidence presented to the Senate inquiry, as well as our own consultations, show that people in the community of Bundaberg do not want the cashless debit card in their town. Mayors of both local areas on the trial region, as I said, Bundaberg and Fraser Coast Shire, publicly oppose the introduction of the cashless debit card in Bundaberg, Hervey Bay. The OREMA evaluation into the effectiveness of the existing trials, which the government relies on so heavily, is inconclusive at best. And I have to say, Madam Assistant Speaker, I have read very closely that evaluation, and it is of a poor quality and certainly should not be relied on by the government and should not be represented or misrepresented by the government as some raging success. You know very well that it is not, and it says clearly that the card has had no effect, particularly in terms of violence in those communities. Labor believes that there is currently insufficient credible evidence to support the establishment of further trials. Labor will only consider the introduction of a new trial site if the government can show that they have an agreed formal consultation process with the community, as well as agreed definition of consent. That is Labor's position. It is completely reasonable if such dramatic changes are going to be made to so many people in that community that there be a bottom-up approach, that it is owned by the community, and it has not been a top-down approach, as we have seen here, and certainly there has to be support of the local community. Labor opposes this bill.
I thank the member and call the member for Hinkler.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you for the member for Barton's contribution. And I'd like to place on the public record an open invitation to the member for Barton to actually come to my electorate. Don't go to a meeting with the local union hacks, but come to a meeting with the people who are providing frontline services in my community. This is a trial extension. This is not a nationwide rollout. This is a proposal for one electorate, and can I say one which is not an Aboriginal community. This is an area where the numbers are nowhere near the levels that there are in the other 3 trial sites. This is a trial which will be in a typical community on the east coast of Australia. It is strongly supported. And certainly, I'd like to make this point firstly. The recommendation of the Senate inquiry was that the trial for the Hinkler electorate be commenced, that this legislation be passed. So it has just been, I've got to say to the member for Barton, I will assume that you've been misinformed, because the Senate inquiry very clearly stated that it supported the rollout of the bill. Secondly, in terms of the mayors, Fraser Coast and Bundaberg, the former mayor of the Fraser Coast Regional Council supported it publicly, and the Bundaberg mayor, I have a 2-page letter of support from the Bundaberg mayor. So I would also say to the member and those listening, particularly in the Senate on the crossbench, Brian Cordes is a former federal Labor member for Hinkler. He is someone who has advocated for this card very strongly, very publicly. He was a former member of this place. He absolutely is committed to his community still, and I commend him for it. There are any number of councillors who have provided us letters of support, have told myself, of course Department of Social Services, that this is something that we should trial. In regards to the cost, Minister Tehan stated in May the cost will be less than $2,000 per person once these numbers in the Hinkler trial electorate are included. That is publicly available and publicly stated. So once again, I would say to those on the crossbench and to my community, I'm sorry this has taken so long. This has been over a year's worth of debate locally. I accept that there are people who will be ideologically opposed. But in terms of consultation, I don't know how much more can we do. The Department of Social Services had done over 100 sets of consultation before this was debated last time. They've now done, according to the DSS, I think around 100 and... Anyway, I'll find that, Madam Speaker. We'll get to that. We'll get to that. They've done extensive rounds of consultation, not just with consumers, not just with merchants, not just with frontline service providers. They have been there for months, months and months and months. Initially, to get an idea of whether there was support, I sent out 32,000 letters. We had an over 10% response rate, very strongly supported. Now, I know that there are people in this place and outside who won't believe me. They think I have a vested interest. Well, that's not the case. And I would say to them, I'm disappointed that this is necessary, but the community strongly supports it. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, the local newspaper engaged ReachTel. Now, I'm sure this is an organisation that those listening and those people, particularly in this place, have heard of. ReachTel is a recognised polling organisation. And what it identified was that there is less than 27.8% of the population who are opposed. Now, it doesn't get a lot better than that, 27.8%. The majority support the cashless card. Bring on the cashless card is the headline. How much more can we possibly do? We are out there talking to people who are dealing with difficult circumstances, and at the end of the day, in my electorate, because this is not a broad-based rollout, this is a cohort which is select, as the member for Barton identified. For those on New Start under the age of 36, parenting payment single, parenting payment partnered, and another type of youth allowance. But the reason we need this amendment was because there are 6,700 people that fall into that cohort. Now, the reason there are so many is because when we consulted with the community, when we talked to the frontline service providers, when we did all of that work, they said to us, it is about children in our electorate. They are not being fed. They are not getting the basic amenities of life. That is completely unacceptable. Now, I accept that this is not the panacea. This is not the only way to deal with this, but this is the only policy which is on the table. My community supports it. They support it strongly. We have been through all of the social media storm. We've dealt with those people from Sydney and Melbourne and Western Australia. And can I say, Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't care what they think. Right? This is down to the ones that live there. It is my electorate. I was born there. I have lived my entire life in this place. This is not acceptable to me. It is not acceptable to them, and they want to do something. I would say to the crossbench senators, this is the time to stand up. It's not your people, but it is something that they want. Now, surely in this place we can get to the point where we can accept what the community wants. We have done all of the consultation. I have had people come to me. I have had the local state member in Hervey Bay telling me how many children he's had to feed that have come through his front door because their parents waste their money on gambling and on alcohol. It is just terrible. The people who work in our local schools, Now, they clearly can't come out. They are employed by the state government. They are restricted from making comment. They have told me that in the district we are feeding over 1,000 children a day for breakfast. This just can't continue. We need to make change. We look at gambling. I've had reports earlier last year where the average numbers in Harvey Bay and Bundaberg are almost $5 million a month. $5 million in a small community like that. This is something which will make a difference. It will make a real difference. And surely, the Labor Party, who was in a bipartisan position earlier, they supported the trial in two sites, in the Kimbleys and of course in Ceduna. Now, they are very strongly Aboriginal communities. I think we both accept that. This is not. We can't say that it is only for those type of communities and not for this one. This is not a nationwide rollout. It is quite simply a trial. 6,700 participants, and the Fraser Coast Chronicle reported that the latest electronic gaming machine statistics released by the Queensland Government showed $23.8 million had been lost just in the Fraser Coast on 1,300 poker machines since January. $23.8 million. This is a card which does not restrict anything else. You can buy whatever you want. It can be used anywhere where EFTPOS is accepted, except for alcohol, gambling products, and of course cash is restricted to restrict access to drugs. Surely we can trial this in one more location which is not an Aboriginal community. As I said, we've done our own consultation very early in the piece to see whether there was significant support to even attempt to do the rest of the consultation and then a rollout in the original trial. 32,000 direct mail-outs, phone polling of around 500, 5,500 emails, as well as calls and emails into my office, just from my office, from our small team of 4 people. Some of the feedback from local constituents. I fully support this move as the drug trade relies on cash. The move to a cashless debit card will hopefully have a significant impact. Yes, the cashless debit card would assist small businesses in revenue and also reap more tax revenue. Centrelink dollars don't go to genuine retailers, not to illegal drug sellers who do not have a tax file number on their illegal sale of revenue. Madam Deputy Speaker, they will not swap a 6-pack of spaghetti for ice. This is about making a real change in our region, one which is wanted. As I said earlier, the local newspaper, Engaged Reach-Tell, they polled 637 people, which is a reasonable size sample. Less than 28% were against. Less than 28%. So, as well as that consultation, I've said the Department of Social Services has undertaken significant consultation. Now, this is by the public service. I don't think there is anyone in this place who would say that the public service are biased. The public service are here to act in the national interest. They are always fair and impartial. From July 2017 to September 2017, DSS conducted 110 meetings in Bundaberg and Harvey Bay. As I said to the member for Barton, after the announcement of the site on 21 September 2017, the department continued to consult and engage with the community and has conducted a total of 188 meetings to December 2017. 188. So we have consulted with business leaders, church leaders, heads of community organisations. They are all keen and eager to trial this for just 2 years. To trial this for just 2 years. Now, as I've said earlier, I absolutely accept that there will be people who are ideologically opposed, but there is no other proposal. No one has put forward any alternative. Not one. Not one of the complainants, not one of the advocates, not one of the social media warriors. None of them have put forward anything else. It is time to trial this in the Hinkler electorate. My community is sick of talking about it. They are, Madam Deputy Speaker. They are sick of talking about this. They just want it implemented. The overwhelming majority of them want this implemented in their region. And fundamentally, this is about kids. This is not about anything else. We have children who are not being fed. I want to do something about it. My community wants to do something about it. We have outstanding support. There are people who have put themselves out, stood up on their feet, said they support the card, to be criticised by those right across the country with access to a computer and Facebook. They have been threatened. They have been told that their businesses shouldn't be used because they support the cashless debit card. It is outrageous, absolutely outrageous what has happened there. So I say to those opposite, this is a trial site for one more location. I don't know what more we can do in terms of consultation. I honestly don't. The department has been there for months. So I once again say to the member for Barton, I have an open invitation for you to come to the electorate. I will put you with the people that provide these services, because what they have said to me is they want to do this. They want to give this a go because they think it will work. And if it doesn't work, well, we will know at the end of the trial. But if it does not commence, we will not know a thing. Nothing. There will be no change. So I say to the crossbench, think very seriously about this before the vote comes to the Senate. I know that there are ongoing discussions with the Minister and those who are looking to support the bill. But once again, can I thank people like Brian Cordes for a former federal Labor member to publicly support this type of policy. Should say to not only those opposite but those in the Senate, this is not a stitch-up. This is a community which is asking for help. The government is trying to roll out something which we think will make a difference, and it should be trialled. So once again, I say to the Senate crossbench, support the bill in the Senate. Consider what the local community wants, not what happens from your political masters or those who might have an ideological view. This is about one community, it's my community, and we want change. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Thank the member. And call the member for Macarthur.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is a bill that I'm really strongly opposed to, and in contrast to the previous speaker, there are alternatives to the cashless debit card, and that involves putting in proper social supports for families that have difficulties. Now, this is a philosophical problem. Look, it's quite ironic that on a day we're talking about, or we're arguing about whether we should give tax cuts to people earning $200,000 a year, that we're arguing about whether we should extend the reach of the cashless debit card. Now, I have no problem with espousing my objections to this bill. It's paternalistic. There are really no evidence that it is going to change anything. And in fact, for some families and some children, it is very likely to make things worse. If there is a problem with gambling, try and look at the gambling issues. Why do we have so many poker machines? Why do we allow people such free access to poker machines? Now, this is a government that is happy to support the poker machine industry, but not happy to support families in distress. Now, I don't like it when politics becomes personal, but to me this is a personal issue. This is a government that is prepared to see the most disadvantaged families in our community be punished for being in the position that they're in and not support them. And this is how I see the cashless debit card. There's no evidence that it works. There is very little effort being put in place to increase services for families in distress. In fact, we've learnt recently that the Minister for Indigenous Affairs is reducing support for drug and alcohol counselling for Indigenous families. So it's no good for those on the other side to say there are no alternatives. There are, and that's to provide proper supports for families in distress. In the Labor Party, we support the will of the community, and from what I hear and see, there is no evidence that the community strongly wants the cashless debit card introduced, in spite of what those on the other side say. We have backed community-led trials in the past, but there is no real evidence that's been produced that shows that the cashless debit card is of benefit to these extremely distressed families. Now, yes, many of these families are Indigenous, but there are others, and indeed in my electorate many people are very concerned about the prospect of the cashless debit card be given wider acceptance. And I think they should be rightly concerned, because this is a government that looks at punishing the poor and supporting the wealthy. What I truly doubt is the cashless debit card's capacity to deliver substantial and lasting benefits over the longer term. I think before we introduce social security measures, to the poorest in our community, we should be very sure that they work before we punish them further. I've worked with these families for many years. They love their kids, they love their families, but they have difficulties. We need to change the argument. Families who have drug and alcohol problems have medical problems. These are medical problems. And we need to look what we can do to support them. A huge issue in my community is homelessness and the difficulty in getting stable housing. That is one way where the government could help these families. The ability to have a stable place of residence is extremely important for many of these very stressed families, particularly in terms of their children getting a stable education. I see families that have to move their kids to school all the time as their housing changes, and the lack of stability of housing is a very important social determinant not only of their health but of their learning. And yet we see a government that's doing very little to improve housing, particularly Indigenous housing, and particularly Indigenous housing in rural and remote areas. So there are alternatives to this punitive measure, and that's to provide proper social supports, something that this government does not appear to acknowledge. We have increasing numbers of children in out-of-home care, particularly Indigenous children. And this government seems to want an argument that we should adopt all those children into other families. What they don't look at is wraparound supports for these very distressed families. Once again, this is a government that's intent on punishing the poor and supporting the top end of town. The cashless debit card, the way it works is that it can be used for purchases, except for gambling and drugs, alcohol, tobacco, etc. It's run by a company called Inju, and it can be used in any sort of bricks and mortar store that accepts the Visa debit card, unless the store's been blocked, and I believe a few have been. It can also be used online. 80% of an individual's welfare payments are used in the cashless debit card, with the remaining 20% being placed in their ordinary savings account. It is removing these families from the ability to manage their own finances. So rather than putting in place ways that they can be helped to manage their finances, we're restricting how they can use their income, and we're not giving them any training in the ability to manage their own finances. So it's, again, a further punishment without a solution. We've seen the government wanting to roll this out town by town, community by community. Now, I am very concerned, as indeed are many people in my community, that the government will roll this out eventually around the country without any discussion and without any proper debate. What we see lacking in this government is any understanding of entrenched disadvantage, of multi-generational disadvantage. Now, I've worked in my community now for 35 years, so I've seen many generations of disadvantage, and I agree it is a major entrenched problem in a very wealthy country like Australia. What I don't see is any understanding or any proposal from this government to deal with entrenched multi-generational disadvantage. It's all about punishment. It's all about personal responsibility and blaming people for being sick or being disadvantaged. And I think that it really is time, when we are having this debate, as I've mentioned, about giving tax cuts to people earning $200,000 a year, it really is time that we try and look at lifting up those most disadvantaged in our community. And that is occurring in education, in health, in jobs, in housing. We need an overall proposal to try and help people on this multi-generational level. And unless we do that, we are going to continue with this piecemeal punishment, blaming, really them versus us type mentality. And I feel very sad about that, because I've been brought up in a very wealthy country. And there needs to be some acknowledgement that we need to be doing better for those that are most disadvantaged. We know that the vast majority of income support recipients can manage their own finances if they can be taught to do so. And in my own electorate of Macarthur, the St Vincent de Paul Society, amongst many, provides some fantastic financial management programs for the most disadvantaged. In fact, at their centre in Campbelltown, they're able to provide interest-free loans. They're able to teach people how to deal with their finances. They're able to try and show them how to manage their housing and their nutrition for their children in an overall package. And they do that by providing comprehensive supports. And they do it in a blameless way, in a way that doesn't blame people for being disadvantaged. In spite of what the Prime Minister talks about opportunity and reaping the rewards of hard work, things happen to people often through not their own fault, and they end up in disadvantage. We know that we've had increasing numbers of gambling outlets around the country with poker machines, the sports betting companies, the online gambling, and to me that is a huge problem, and we know that it causes problems often in those most disadvantaged. We've recently had the rollout in my electorate of the payday lending now being available through a machine at Minto in one of the very disadvantaged areas of my electorate. Now, what the government should be doing is trying to prevent things like that happening, that will put people at more disadvantage, rather than punishing them by introducing the cashless debit card. It really is not about trying to improve things and to help people. It's by trying to corral people already extremely disadvantaged in a continuing cycle of disadvantage, and something that I feel very sad about. We need to look at more radical ways of helping people. We need to look at wraparound services for these very disadvantaged families. One of my paediatric colleagues who works in a very remote rural area has spoken to me about not removing children from very disadvantaged families, but having areas where these families can go, where they can be given wraparound support, where they can stay with their children and be given help with things like drug and alcohol counselling, help with nutrition, help with their medical problems, and these families often have quite significant chronic medical disorders as well. So that we're looking at more a way of countering this multi-generational disadvantage. Once again, the cashless debit card is really very likely to, I believe, to compound and continue this cycle. Now, I know that you know, at first sight, it may well be an initial way of seemingly preventing people getting their drugs and their alcohol. In fact, we know that people who have addictions, and don't forget addiction is a medical problem, people who have addictions will get their drugs and alcohol in any way they can. And that may well mean turning to crime, using their cashless debit card to get things and then on-selling them. This really is not an answer, in spite of what those on the other side may think. Now, I would counsel those in the Liberal National Party to really think about what they're doing and think about more comprehensive and more appropriate services for the disadvantaged, rather than continuing to blame them. We really, I think, have had enough of blaming the poor and had enough of trying to corralling those with social disadvantage in a continuing cycle of poverty and a continuing cycle of dependency, and we need to look at more comprehensive ways of getting them out of that. I see the cashless debit card as being part of this, and I am strongly opposed to it. I would encourage members opposite to come into the most disadvantaged areas of their communities and ask them what they think they need. Because I think this paternalistic attitude of imposition from above and then not providing support services is becoming a characteristic of this government. And we've seen this with the cutbacks in Centrelink staff, the difficulties accessing Centrelink for very disadvantaged people. Not infrequently I have people come into my office who have no computer skills at all, asking me and my staff to help them access Centrelink supports. They have no idea, including recently an 88-year-old lady asking for that support. And I think that's very sad and a demonstration of a philosophical problem with a Liberal National Party government. They do not understand the issues of the most disadvantaged. And I feel very, very sad about that. Now, there has been a lot of research work undertaken by those who've had a lifetime in the field of social supports. And there are, we know, social determinants of a whole range of things, including health and education. And I would encourage those on the other side to have a look at the social determinants of these things and see what they can do to break the cycle. The continued extension of the cashless debit card is really avoiding looking at the problem and looking for solutions.
Time has
Thank you.
expired. I thank the member and call the member for Tangney.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I rise to speak on the Social Services Legislation Amendment, Cashless Debit Card Trial Expansion Bill 2018. And isn't it interesting when we hear all of these reasons why this bill shouldn't be passed, but those members opposite from the Labor Party are happy to have the trial, or indeed supported the trial, in majority Indigenous communities, but not in these white communities, where this bill seeks to implement the trial of the cashless debit card in the Bundaberg and Hervey Bay area in Queensland, the fourth trial location for this very important program, where people under 36 years of age and accessing New Start, Youth Allowance, Job Seeker and the parenting payment will receive the card. This is about 6,700 people. The cashless debit or healthy welfare card is about making lives better. I'm in this place to empower people to take control of their lives and for the government, where it needs to co-invest in their future, to help hard-working Australians reach their full potential, to help aspirational Australians reach their potential. Helping these Australians is my focus when we look at our social policy and welfare system. I remind the members opposite that the cashless debit card doesn't impact on a person's eligibility to access welfare. It doesn't change the amount of Centrelink a person receives. It simply means that they can't use all of their cash to buy alcohol, drugs or gamble or to withdraw cash, because the card operates and looks like a normal bank card. In our communities, the lazy application of cash as welfare isn't working. In some cases, it's making lives worse. But the cashless debit card is actually making lives better, and the strong independent evaluation results from the current trial communities is telling us just how important this card is. The final independent evaluation of the debit card trial includes results from the first two trial communities, Sejuna in South Australia and East Kimberley in Western Australia in my state. The cashless debit card has a considerable positive impact for the people participating in the trial. 41% reported drinking alcohol less frequently. People are now seeking medical treatment for the conditions that were previously masked by the effects of alcohol. 48% reported using illegal drugs less often. 48% reported gambling less. 40% of participants who have caring responsibility reported they had been better able to care for their children. Better able to care for their children. 39% of participants with caring responsibilities reported they had become more involved in their children's homework and schooling when compared to before the trial. 45% have been better able to save more money. This card is not a silver bullet, that is certainly true. We know and acknowledge that. But it's an important tool in the fight against alcohol and drug abuse and the violence and crime that comes with that. This careful and independent evaluation tells us the cashless debit card is absolutely making lives better. And I've seen this firsthand when I visited Kununurra and Wyndham in WA's north. I personally met with many people who supported the card, and I met with those that don't. The number of pickups made by the Kununurra Community Patrol Service for alcohol was lower. Admissions to the Wyndham Sobering Up Unit in September were lower. Ambulance alcohol-related call-outs were down. And sales at the Wyndham bottle shop, the only bottle shop in Wyndham, dropped. I visited the Wyndham supermarket and I was told that because of economic conditions, sales across the store had dropped. But since the implementation of this card, the sales had remained at the same levels despite the drop in economic conditions for baby products. I met with community leaders who helped me to get to the nuts and bolts of this policy. I sat with the mums at the Wyndham Early Learning Activity Centre. I heard those Indigenous mothers talk about their aspiration for their children and the benefit that this card was having in their community. I met with the Chamber of Commerce and a number of health and cultural organisations. I met with the police at Kununurra and heard the issues they have to deal with day and night, and was so pleased. And I was pleased to hear that alcohol-fuelled call-outs were down. But I also spent a 12-hour shift with the St John Ambulance. The shift went from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. and we were responding to calls. And while I can't share with you, because of confidentiality reasons, the precise nature of those calls, every one of them on that overnight shift was related to alcohol. The conditions in which the individuals we visited to provide support and to meet their medical needs were shameful. They were terrible conditions. The issue of alcoholisation in those communities has not been addressed by the mere fact of giving easy money to individuals, but it is starting to be fixed under this card, but this card alone won't do it. When you've got those ambulance volunteers at St John's Ambulance telling you just how important this card is in dealing with alcohol illness and consequences of the alcohol-fuelled violence every night, you have to take their word for it. And so I'm the government's chair of our Social Policy Committee. You can read reports and you can talk to peak bodies, but to go and spend 3 days in these communities and see how lives are actually changing for the better makes you a very strong advocate for what we're trying to achieve here. Now, expanding the cashless debit card trial to Bundaberg and the Hervey Bay area will build on the positive evidence-based findings that we've had already. Bundaberg and Hervey Bay is an opportunity to test the card's effectiveness under new parameters in an area with a significantly lower proportion of Indigenous participants and on a larger scale when compared to the current communities covered under the trial. There is concern that this card targets the majority Indigenous communities. That's what I was told when I was in the East Kimberley, that some people called this the white card. It was the white fella's card restricting the Indigenous individuals' way they can spend their money. So they couldn't just go to the bottle shop. This was paternalistic. Yeah, I'm happy to accept that. But one of the things that was said to me by the Indigenous leaders in the East Kimberley was just how they wanted this card to be seen not as a tool of dealing with Indigenous issues, but they wanted this card seen as dealing with the issues at hand of alcohol in their communities, of drugs and gambling in their communities. And the issues of alcohol, drugs and gambling are not racist. They don't care if someone's Indigenous or not. They don't care if they're white or black. And that's why it's very interesting that this trial, which is opposed by the Labor Party, is opposed. Why are they opposing the extension of this card to Bundaberg and Hervey Bay, where it's a majority urban and majority non-Indigenous population? It's something that I just can't understand. I hope these trials in these new communities will dispel this perception. It's actually very important and very respectful to those Indigenous leaders in the existing trial sites that we actually do this new trial in Bundaberg and Hervey Bay. This area has been chosen carefully to address social problems that were identified during the extensive consultations in the community there. Between May and December 2017, there were 188 meetings about the cashless debit card trial with a broad range of stakeholders, including the community sector, service providers, community members and all levels of government. It's an area of high youth unemployment and intergenerational welfare dependence, as well as the high use of alcohol, drugs and gambling, are some of the big issues this community is facing. Wide Bay region has one of the highest rates of youth unemployment in Queensland. Data from March 2008 shows youth unemployment in the region is around 28.7%, which is an increase of 4% since March 2017. You can't get a job if you're bombed out of your brain on drugs, and you can't get a job if you're drunk. You certainly can't keep one as well. For all of those who are aged under 30 on welfare today, 90% had a parent who was on welfare during the past 15 years. Consultations also revealed significant problems with alcohol and drugs and gambling among young families. Drug use data from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare shows that both Bundaberg and the Fraser Coast have an estimated usage rate of 15.7% higher than the national average. If there is a place where this card needs to be trialled, it is this location. Queensland Health data indicated 1,547 incidents of care for alcohol and other drugs treatment in 2015-16. According to the National Drug Strategy Household Survey, people who are unemployed are 2.4 times more likely to use drugs such as ice and other amphetamines than those who are employed. Trialling the cashless debit card in the Bundaberg and Hervey Bay area will be an important investment by individuals and government to stabilise the lives of these young people in the communities by limiting their spending on alcohol, drugs and gambling, and helping to improve their chances of finding a job, keeping that job or successfully completing education or training. A stable home environment during those early formative years is an imperative for positive lifelong outcomes. Setting the age limit at 36 means the government in this trial location can work with young people, their families and their children who are receiving welfare payments. Complementing the card in this trial location will be a further investment in community services of $1 million. And that's very important, and we learnt that in Kununurra and East Kimberley. But the card alone doesn't work by itself. You need those wraparound services that the member for Macarthur was talking about, but you can have both. You can have those additional wraparound services, you can have the card. Are we trialling just the card? No, we're not trialling just the card. We are trialling the card and those services to see if they're sufficient. Already there are a significant number of services in place in this region, including 70 federally funded services in Bundaberg, Hervey Bay area, which include drug and alcohol services, financial capability services, employment, family and children programs. At a technical level, this bill also amends the list of restricted goods to include cash-like products. There's always been the intention that participants should not be able to purchase cash-like products such as gift cards, vouchers, money orders, digital currencies, which could be used to purchase alcohol and gambling products. This was one of the issues identified in earlier trials and one of the issues that I identified when I visited Kununurra and Wyndham. The Bundaberg and Hervey Bay area is an opportunity for the government to test the card's flexibility as a tool to support people in urban locations and to help address the problems identified during the community consultations. I've updated the House on my own experience and where I've seen the intersection of welfare and drugs from my own family. I don't believe for a second that the life, you can call it, that being lived by so many job seekers with drug and alcohol dependence is one they choose to live. The cashless debit card is making lives better in the trial communities. We have an obligation to extend these trials to a non-Indigenous population, more urban like environment to continue to trial the success of this card. I commend the work of the Minister for Social Services and the Minister for Human Services. I commend the work of the Attorney-General and the Minister for Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs, who previously held ministerial roles in this area and championed this trial significantly. The extension of the cashless debit card has my full support. The extension of this trial to this location has my full support. I have said many times in the past, and I will say it again, working age welfare should not be compensation for where someone has found themselves in life. Working age welfare must and always should be an investment in where they can go. That's what it must be, Deputy Speaker, an investment. And if you are investing in something, you need to make sure that investment is getting the outcome that you desire. And the outcome that we desire is to have less people on drugs, less people on alcohol, less people on gambling and wasting their money in that way, and more people in work being exactly what they are, what I am, an aspirational Australian wanting to apply my effort to get ahead. And because the Labor Party see the lazy application of cash in our welfare system as their only solution, can I tell them the lazy application of cash is not working, but the cashless debit card is, and the Labor Party should get on board and make sure that we can work together to improve the lives of people in our community and to make sure that our welfare system does exactly what it should do, and that is to make lives better.
I thank the member and call the member for Herbert.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise in this place today to make it very clear to the Turnbull government that the community in my electorate of Herbert will not support the cashless debit card. But what we will support is early intervention and prevention programs that would assist people to move past their desperate and often very complex circumstances. We are repeatedly witnessing attempts to expand the use of the cashless card across the country, and I know that it won't be too long before the Turnbull government will focus on my electorate of Herbert. And as I have stated, under no circumstances will we accept the implementation of the cashless card in my electorate. What this bill seeks to do is extend the cashless debit card trial to Bundaberg and Hervey Bay. If this bill is successful, all recipients of New Start, Youth Allowance, Other and Parenting Payment in the electorate of Hinkler who are under 36 will be forced to become trial participants. The cashless debit card quarantines 80% of income support payment onto a special debit card which cannot be used to purchase alcohol, gamble or buy gift cards, which could in turn be used to purchase alcohol or to gamble. The evaluation clearly questions these measures. The Orima evaluation into the effectiveness of the existing trials is inconclusive at best. The evaluation has been thoroughly criticised by leading academics, and there is insufficient credible evidence at this point in time to support the establishment of further trials. It is expected that around 6,700 people in Bundaberg and Hervey Bay would become trial participants. The mayors of both local government areas in the trial region, Bundaberg and Fraser Coast Shire, publicly opposed the introduction of the cashless debit card in their areas. The community doesn't want it. The local council doesn't want it. So why on earth is this government rolling it out? Does this government think it knows better than the mayor, the local councillors and the local community? I fully support community-driven initiatives to tackle drug and alcohol misuse. That is why at the last election I committed $5 million towards the Salvation Army drug and alcohol detox facility for young people. A commitment, I might add, that the LNP did not match. That's how governments should be supporting communities. Community social problems will not be solved by a blanket income management program. The vast majority of income support recipients are more than capable of managing their own finances. I do not support a national rollout of the cashless debit card. Labor has said all along that we will talk to individual communities and make decisions on a location-by-location basis. Labor will only consider the introduction of a new trial site if the Turnbull government can demonstrate that they have an agreed formal consultation process with the communities involved, as well as an agreed definition of consent. The Hinkler area has said that they don't want it, so that is why Labor will oppose this bill. The Turnbull government is hell-bent on targeting the most vulnerable citizens. The implementation of the card is an assumption that all those who are 35 years of age and under, receiving New Start, Youth Allowance, Job Seeker, parenting payment single or parenting payment partnered, are using their money inappropriately. I asked the members of the Turnbull government how each of them would feel if they were labelled an alcoholic. How would the members of this government feel about automatically being labelled a gambler? How would members opposite feel if they were labelled a drug addict? I assume that they would not be very impressed at all. Essentially, this is what the cashless debit card is doing to those who are already struggling to survive. Madam Deputy Speaker, I represent the electorate of Herbert, which includes the remote community of Palm Island. Palm Island is a small community of over 3,500 people. The island has an unemployment rate of 29% and an underemployment rate of 20%. According to the 2016 census, 24.1% of households on Palm had a weekly household income of less than $650. The census also showed of the people aged 15 years and over on Palm, 74.9% did unpaid domestic work in the week before the census. Madam Deputy Speaker, Palm Island is a developing community and a hidden gem in North Queensland. Given Palm Island doesn't have a big economy, people look at the debit card as a way backwards, certainly not a way forward. The Palm Island Council and the residents of Palm Island want job creation and economic development opportunities, because job creation is a much better option for the people on Palm than a cashless debit card. Townsville has an unemployment rate of over 8% and a youth unemployment rate of over 20%. To date, we have seen no investment in our region by the Turnbull government, and after nearly 3 years we are still waiting on NAIF to actually move past announcements and put some money on the table for the projects that have been announced, as that will get jobs underway. Palm Island, Townsville and all of the communities in Northern Australia need investment. Investment in infrastructure projects, tourism and education will not only kickstart our economies, but they will be the catalyst for job creation in a number of industries. Labor's position on the cashless welfare trial has always been, as I have said, to support trial areas where the community has a desire to try something new to address drug and alcohol misuse. I am always open to considering genuine efforts to assist and support people in my community who are struggling with drug and alcohol dependency to access appropriate treatment. I don't believe that income support is best utilised to support a drug habit. However, vulnerable people's lives are very complex. As community representatives, we must remember that we are talking about people's lives. These are entrenched social issues that cannot and will not be solved by income management alone. We must address the core issues that contribute to drug and alcohol misuse. The vast majority of income support recipients are more than capable of managing their own finances, and many of these people I have spoken to, and they feel it would be deeply insulting to be inflicted in such a regime. The Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights conducted a review of the Social Security Legislation Amendment Debit Card Trial Bill in 2015, which noted that the cashless debit card engages and limits 3 human rights: the right to social security, the right to a private life and the right to equality and non-discrimination. By reducing a person's choice in how and where they access and spend their social security payments, the cashless debit card program limits the right to a private life. Labor has said that we never support a blanket approach to income management. We will not support a trial where the community insists it does not want a trial and also knows that it is not the solution they are seeking. And that is why we do not support this bill. Labor will continue to consult with individual communities to ensure that their requests are met while addressing social hardships. The Turnbull government released the evaluation of the trials on the 1st of September. The evaluation showed mixed results. There have been serious concerns regarding Coronella and Ceduna particularly. If you look at the report, 78% of the people said there'd been little to no change, and some said they had in fact been worse off. The Senate Inquiry Committee heard from the people of Coronella, who stated that the card isn't working. Police reported increased levels of violence, and the not-for-profit sector in the town are reporting that children are going hungry. You can't just put a card in place without other interventions and expect behavioural change to occur. particularly when our First Nations people in that area stated that they weren't asked about the card and weren't consulted about what they thought were more appropriate solutions. Mr Deputy Speaker, I have received numerous emails and messages from members in my community who are against the implementation of the cashless debit card in Townsville. People have a grave fear of invasion of privacy and that the cashless welfare card is a band-aid attempt to address a far more complex social matter. The people of my community would prefer the funds for this card to be invested in things like infrastructure that would actually create jobs. Townsville is in desperate need of water infrastructure investment. Federal Labor has committed $100 million towards securing long-term solution to Townsville's water needs, as well as $200 million towards developing hydroelectricity on the Burdekin Falls Dam. Labor has also committed $75 million towards our port expansion project. This single investment alone will generate more than $500 million back into our local community, as well as hundreds of jobs. These projects should be priorities for the Turnbull government, not implying that people who receive welfare supports are criminals who frivolously spend their money. The best way that we will address the situations that we find ourselves in where people are struggling with alcohol and drug misuse is to fund early intervention and prevention support programs. Programs that focus on the social needs of families who are struggling in communities. Programs that support kids to get to school. Programs that ensure that young people get a good education so they can move into work. Funding infrastructure creates jobs. Pretending to think that working on an income management strategy will cure the ills of the world and get people into work is simply not even clear thinking by this government. So I urge this government to seriously consider early intervention and prevention and to consult with communities where this government thinks they will benefit from income management programs, because I am sure these communities can tell you loudly and clearly what they need to support people living in their communities.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It's always good to follow the hard-working member for Herbert, my friend Cathy O'Toole, who is always standing up on behalf of her constituents and indeed all the people right around this country who will be adversely affected by this bill, which seeks to extend the cashless debit card trial to regions in Bundaberg and in Hervey Bay, forcing anybody under 36 to become a trial participant. We oppose this bill. Labor knows that the majority of income support recipients are more than capable of managing their own income. This morning, Deputy Speaker, I was over in the Federation Chamber and I was listening to the member for Dunkley, a member on the opposite side of the House, talk about how he received income support when he was a university student. Now, it's a great shame that the member for Dunkley isn't here, because I would be able to ask him how would he feel if, as a recipient of a welfare payment, he was told how and when and on what he was able to spend his own money on. Communities are not homogenous, Deputy Speaker. They are inherently unique with their own customs and circumstances, and it is an absolute disgrace that this government is willing to paint all of the regional communities where they want to roll this out with one swift brush. The government refuses to acknowledge the importance of community by consulting by community on community level, and allow that community to have some decision-making, as well as the need to support community-driven initiatives. But again, is it really a surprise that this government, the government of the rich and plenty, wishes to take a top-down approach to the cashless debit card? I think not. The current limitations placed on the cashless welfare card trials are crucial to ensuring that this government does not overstep its bounds with rural and regional communities. And as we've heard from the member for Herbert, there are some significant factors in the breaches of a person's human rights when it comes to these trials and the cashless debit card itself. Extending the trial to potentially include around 6,700 more people in Bundaberg and Hervey Bay without the appropriate consultations is blatantly irresponsible, thus bringing the number of participants to over 15,000. Key groups from the Bundaberg region have been ignored, Deputy Speaker. Ignoring the wishes of the Bundaberg community presented to the Senate inquiry is blatantly irresponsible, it's arrogant and it is out of touch, all the key themes of this government. It is clearer than crystal that this Turnbull government has mismanaged and bungled this entire process, and it is the people of the Bundaberg and Hervey Bay regions that will pay the price. Unlike in the East Kimberley and Ceduna trials, the lack of consultation in the Goldfields and Hervey Bay areas is symptomatic of this government that doesn't listen, don't communicate and doesn't implement their promises. This lack of action in the East Kimberley is in stark contrast to the hope that the trial of the card was thought to deliver. Mothers hoping that their families would see support programs and training to help break the cycle, the treacherous cycle that is disadvantage, did never materialise. Labor will only consider supporting the introduction of a new trial site if this Liberal government can do its job properly and consult the communities they are planning on affecting. This government needs to show they are willing to listen to communities and establish an agreed definition of consent. The trial of the cashless debit card has been viewed through a prism of suspicion and mistrust. It takes a great leap of faith for communities to commit to this implementation, and the government ought to respect that. That's why we've consulted closely on this side of the House with people in Ceduna and East Kimberley, listening to their views widely, discreetly and with humility and with compassion. We support genuine, intuitive, progressive policies that acknowledge the problems and opportunities that are unique to remote and discrete communities. We are talking about people who have suffered greatly already at the hands of government, their representatives and others. Yet the original problem of systemic inequality, domestic and other violence remains, for the very reason we were told these trials were needed. This is hardly encouraging for potential participants in Hervey Bay and Goldfield areas targeted by this legislation. This government has paid $1.6 million to Orima Research to provide a weak and poor evaluation into the effectiveness of the existing trials in Ceduna and the East Kimberley. The results were inconclusive at best and torn apart by leading academics like Janet Hunt, who stated that people interviewed for the evaluation may have told interviewers that they drank less than before the trial began, but that such recall over a year is not likely to be reliable. Importantly, her paper also notes the fact that participants were required to identify themselves prior to participation. This raises serious questions about how they would respond and, in some cases, understand the questions and implications of their answers. It would be surprising if someone with a drug problem who has been identified by the interviewer would suddenly open up and discuss their volume of usage. Only 17% of the trial participants reported that they felt their children's lives were better as a result of the trial. The Orima research is not something the government should be basing its policy decision-making on. It is at best a poor quality assessment and at worst a demonstration of this government's negligence. These problems vary from community to community, country to country, state to state. There is no one-size-fits-all answer. We need to develop the levers that provide access to support when and where it is suitable, programs that address alcohol and drug-related problems, as well as policies that seek to address the systemic inequality that has placed these communities in the vulnerable positions they find themselves in. These communities do not need empty promises or rhetoric and half-baked attempts that are more likely to hinder and not help them. They need to be heard, consulted with. We need to listen to communities to find out what assistance they require and in their voices, and tailor programs to suit specific locations. One size does not fit all. This isn't a scarf, it's not a pair of gloves and it's not a beanie, Minister. This is not appropriate. To the 15th of March this year, the trials have cost around $24 million for those two sites. The cost per head is well over $10,000. Deputy Speaker, I do not profess to sit on in the Treasury coffins or with those boffins that spend our money for us, but I would assume that $10,000 could have been better directed for these individuals at things that actually went to the heart and the core of addressing some of the issues they find themselves in. We have no idea what this minister intends to charge taxpayers to roll out the cashless debit card in Bundaberg and Hervey Bay, and I don't know how the minister expects us to debate this legislation without this crucial information. This is symptomatic of a government's problematic approach to the way they run this country, which we saw this morning. Turnbull's mob doesn't want this parliament to be informed before making decisions, let alone the average Australian. And we saw that on trial this morning here, Deputy Speaker. The government needs to be honest with this parliament and tell us how much the trial at Bundaberg and Hervey Bay and the goldfields in WA will cost. The fact that they haven't already is an absolute disgrace. The government has spent around $24 million, as I said, on current trials alone, $7.9 million paid to Indu to manage the payment system, $1.6 million for useless and unreliable research. They have mismanaged the Australian taxpayers' money and they have damaged lives in the process. The 2016 census tells us that Australia's Indigenous population has grown by 17.4% since 2011. That's an estimated 3.3% of our total population and an estimated just slightly under 800,000 people who are concerned about the implications of a rollout of the cashless debit card. We need to be mindful of the implications of an extension of these trials and the psychological impact it has on every Indigenous person, regardless of where they live. It is imperative that we take actions of previous governments into account when we are discussing serious amendments and extensions such as the one before the House today. It is also important to note that these populations are also centred in the major cities, particularly in electorates like mine in Lindsay, Deputy Speaker. People who have suffered and been hurt by our collective actions, however well-intended they may be. People need to be reassured that our commitment to the implementation of effective education, rehabilitation and training programs are essential. They are essential to ensure that the inequality, suspicion and historical dislocation are addressed in ways that are consultative, well-resourced, well-researched and effectively delivered. While we know that most people have the ability to self-manage their incomes, we also understand that some people do need a hand. Extending the rollout of the cashless debit card without appropriate consultation and research is not an effective way of giving people a hand. It also clearly demonstrates that blatant negligence and contempt that the Turnbull government has for some of our most vulnerable Australian communities and people. Labor opposes this bill because there is insufficient, credible evidence to support the establishment of further trials. Who would have thought that if you need evidence in order to make an informed decision? In this case, the government may have been a bit confused. Proper consultation means working together with communities to ensure they get the programs they need and desire. Proper consultation means not lecturing communities you are consulting, but making a commitment to listening, discussing, acknowledge and acting on their aspirations. Systematic disadvantage cannot be solved with income management alone. This government needs to provide additional support to communities who elect to participate in those trials. And that support needs to be targeted and it needs to be based on research and evidence. It is time for this government to sit down and listen to what these vulnerable communities are saying. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the Minister.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I thank all of the members for their contribution at this second reading debate stage of the Social Services Legislation Amendment Cashless Debit Card Trial Expansion Bill. The bill, as is now well known, seeks to add the Bundaberg and Hervey Bay area as a cashless debit card trial area under the Social Security Administration Act 1999. And the bill specifies trial participants in this site as persons under 36 years, receiving New Start Allowance, Youth Allowance, Job Seeker and Parenting Payment Single or Parenting Payment Partner. The trial would cover around 6,700 people in the trial area, and the selection of the cohort in this area has occurred in response to significant consultation with the relevant communities. The bill would allow the Bundaberg and Hervey Bay trial site to operate until 30 June 2020, allowing time to implement the trial and for it to operate for at least 12 months. The cashless debit card, of course, aims to reduce the devastating effects of alcohol, drug and gambling abuse in our communities. The card operates like an ordinary debit card, with the primary difference being that it does not work at liquor stores or gambling houses and it cannot be used to withdraw cash. Consequently, illicit products cannot be purchased with the card, and the trial restricts what participants can spend their social security payments on, but does not detract from the eligibility of a person to receive welfare, nor does it reduce the amount of a person's social security entitlement. The trial of the cashless debit card has been ongoing in Ceduna, South Australia, and in the East Kimberley region in my home state of Western Australia for more than 2 years. In February this year, Parliament passed legislation to allow the program to continue in these communities and to be expanded to a third site in the Goldfields area, again in Western Australia, which trial commenced in March 2018. The payment types and age group for this site were selected based on extensive consultation by the Department of Social Services. Between May and September 2017, over 188 meetings, including 3 community information sessions, were held across the Bundaberg and Hervey Bay area. These canvassed views from a very broad range of stakeholders, including the community sector, service providers, community members, church groups, the business sector and all levels of government. These meetings demonstrated a clear need for support and intervention in the areas of youth unemployment, young families and intergenerational welfare dependency. As a result of those meetings with the communities of Bundaberg and Hervey Bay, it was clear that many people in those areas wish to tackle the serious issues of youth unemployment and long-term and intergenerational welfare dependency. 90% of the people in Bundaberg and Hervey Bay under 30 and on New Start or youth allowance had a parent or guardian who received income support at some point in the previous 15 years. Further still, of that cohort, around 13% had a parent or guardian who had received income support at least once each year for the past 15 years. Further, research by the Australian Research Council indicates that risk factors such as attitudes to work and welfare, attitudes to alcohol and drug consumption and family influences contributed greatly to intergenerational welfare dependency. The Australian Research Council also found evidence that young people from welfare-dependent families were more likely to smoke, drink alcohol or consume illegal drugs, thus highlighting the relationship that welfare dependence has on a young person's outcomes in life. A stable domestic environment with limited exposure to risk factors during formative years is imperative for positive lifelong outcomes. The cashless debit card can help to stabilise the lives of young people in the new trial locations by limiting spending on alcohol, drugs and gambling, and thus improving the chances of young Australians of finding employment or successfully completing education or training. The government has also announced a second evaluation of the cashless debit card across all 3 current trial sites to assess the ongoing effectiveness of the program. The second evaluation will use research methodologies developed independently by the University of Queensland and draw on the baseline measurements of social conditions in the Goldfields developed by the University of Adelaide. The initial and positive findings of the impact of the cashless debit card in Ceduna and the East Kimberley have been encouraging. The expansion to Bundaberg and Hervey Bay will help to test the card and the technology that supports it in more diverse communities and settings. This will, of course, build on the evidence available to further evaluate the impacts and outcomes of the cashless debit card on all participants. The government remains committed to rolling this program out to the Bundaberg and Hervey Bay area and addressing the issues of social and economic disadvantage in those areas.
I thank the Minister. The question is that this bill be now read a second time. All those of that opinion say aye. Those against no. I think the ayes have it. Noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes.
We're going to win this one.
Sure, with that scattergun approach, she'll give you right something.
Slow, I know.
Lock the doors. Order. The question is this bill be now read a second time. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Capricornia and Grey tellers for the ayes, and the honourable members for Lawler and Morton tellers for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 75, noes 62. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. The clerk.
Second reading, a bill for an act to amend the law relating to social security and for related purposes.
Is leave granted for the third reading to be moved immediately? The member for Kingsford Smith.
Yep.
Leave is granted. The Minister.
I move that the bill now be read a third time, Mr.
Question
Speaker.
is the bill be now read a third time. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The clerk.
Third reading, a bill for an act to amend the law relating to social security and for related purposes.